One of these men parachuted behind enemy lines to fight alongside a resistance army most people have never heard of, and never once discussed it in an interview for the rest of his life. Another one commanded a boat that never came home, except he wasn't on it that day. These weren't stuntmen. These weren't consultants hired to make a war film look real. These were the actors themselves, living it first and acting it second. Before there was Hollywood glamour, there was a generation of British actors who put down their scripts and picked up a rifle, a radio set, or a parachute harness. Today we're counting down 15 of them. Not the household names you already know the war stories of, but the ones whose service somehow got left out of the highlight reel. Some of these men saw the worst of it. A couple of them, honestly, didn't, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. That's part of the story too. Let's start the countdown. Before we start, how many of these 15 do you think you already know the war record of? Comment your guess. If you like stories that don't get told anywhere else, subscribe now. We're not repeating names you've already heard on every other channel. Jack Hawkins. Jack Hawkins spent decades on screen as the definitive British military man, the naval officer in the Cruel Sea, the general in Laurence of Arabia. So here's the other part people assume. They assume he fought. He didn't, not in the way you're picturing. Hawkins was commissioned into the Royal Welch Fusiliers in 1941, then transferred to run entertainment for British troops across India and Southeast Asia, eventually leaving the army as an honorary colonel, having spent the war keeping soldiers' morale up rather than firing a weapon at anyone. Here's the part we're not going to skip past. Putting him at 15 instead of leaving him off the list entirely is a deliberate choice. Not every wartime contribution looked like a battlefield, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to both the men who fought and the ones who kept them sane enough to keep fighting. Is that the same thing as combat? No. Should it be treated the same on a list literally titled, Who Fought? That's a fair question, and we're leaving it open rather than dodging it. But Bernard Lee's story, that one has a very different kind of quiet to it. Bernard Lee, for 11 James Bond films, Bernard Lee played M, the unshowy, no-nonsense head of the entire British Secret Intelligence Service. The man who sent 07 into danger and never broke a sweat doing it. Off-screen, Lee spent 1940 to 1946 actually in uniform, serving with the Royal Sussex Regiment for the full run of the war before returning to acting afterward. Here's what's easy to miss. Lee never played up his service the way some of his contemporaries did. No memoirs about it, no interview anecdotes. The most famous authority figure in British spy cinema was, in real life, exactly as understated about his war as M was about his feelings. That's not a coincidence you can fake. That's 6 years of it becoming who he was. Michael Hordan's war, on the other hand, put that famous voice to a very specific kind of use. Michael Hordan had one of the most recognizable voices in British acting. Rich, commanding, impossible to ignore. During the war, the Royal Navy found a use for exactly that. After training on a merchant ship running ammunition to Alexandria, Hordan was commissioned, trained in radar and fighter direction, and served as fighter direction officer aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, rising to lieutenant commander by the time he was demobbed in 1945. Think about that for a second. The same instrument that would later terrify audiences as the ghost of Jacob Marley was, a decade earlier, relaying live combat information across a warship's deck in the Mediterranean. His acting training didn't happen to help the war effort. The Navy specifically went looking for a voice like his. Stuart Granger's war ended a lot faster and a lot less dramatically. Stuart Granger enlisted with the Gordon Highlanders at the start of the war and was commissioned into the Black Watch as a second lieutenant. Then, in 1942, a stomach ulcer ended it. He was invalided out of the army before he ever saw sustained action and went straight back into film work that same year. We're not going to dress this up as heroism, it wasn't. Plenty of men who wanted to fight never got the chance to, for reasons entirely outside their control, and Granger's story is a useful reminder that served in the war covers an enormous range of outcomes, from parachuting behind enemy lines to being sent home by your own digestive system. Neither one was his choice. John Mills was sent home by almost the exact same thing. John Mills enlisted in the Royal Engineers in September 1939 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and then, in 1942, was medically discharged with a stomach ulcer, the same condition that ended Stuart Granger's service around the same time. Here's the pattern worth naming out loud. 2 future stars of British war cinema, both men who'd go on to play soldiers under fire with total conviction, were actually sent home by their own bodies before the fighting really started for them. It's tempting to assume the men who made the most convincing war films must have seen the most war. Mills and Granger are proof that isn't automatically true. Their credibility on screen came from somewhere else, from watching, from listening to the men who did see it, and from carrying the guilt of an early discharge into every performance. Nigel Patrick's war took him a lot further than either of theirs did. Nigel Patrick. Nigel Patrick joined the King's Royal Rifle Corps as a private at the outbreak of war and was commissioned as an officer soon after. Over the next 6 years, he served through the Middle East, North Africa, and Italy, rising all the way to lieutenant colonel by the time the war ended. Here's the question worth sitting with. Patrick spent years fighting through 3 separate campaigns, came home, and never became a household name the way some of the men on this list did. He became a reliable, respected character actor instead. Would you have expected the man with the longest actual combat record on this list to end up the least famous for it? That gap between service and recognition says something about how randomly fame gets handed out. James Robertson Justice's story has an irony in it that's almost too perfect. James Robertson Justice. James Robertson Justice was, by every account from people who worked with him, one of the great embellishers of British film. He claimed a Scottish birthplace he didn't have, adjusted his own birth year, and told stories about his pre-war adventures that colleagues openly doubted. So here's the twist. His war record isn't one of the exaggerations. He joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve in 1939, was wounded by shrapnel in 1943, and was honorably discharged with a pension. A plain, verifiable, unglamorous fact sitting in the middle of a life otherwise built on tall tales. That's genuinely funny if you think about it right. The one man on this list famous for inventing his own legend didn't need to invent this part. The truth was already dramatic enough, and he barely mentioned it. Peter Ustinov's war had its own kind of absurdity, just a very different flavor. Peter Ustinov. Peter Ustinov served as a private in the British Army and ended up assigned as batman, personal servant, to a lieutenant colonel, because Army protocol made it impossible for a private and a senior officer to socialize as equals any other way. That lieutenant colonel was David Niven, and the two of them worked together on the 1944 film The Way Ahead, which Ustinov also helped write. Sit with the rank gap for a second. The lowest rank in the British Army, assigned to personally serve one of its most senior officers, and the two of them ended up co-writing a film together. Ustinov didn't outrank Niven for a single day of the war, but by the time the cameras rolled, nobody was checking insignia. Talent found its own hierarchy, even inside one that technically didn't allow it. Ralph Richardson's war put him in the cockpit, which, by most accounts, was a mistake. Ralph Richardson volunteered for the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as a pilot in the Fleet Air Arm, despite, by his own admission, being a genuinely timid flyer. He rose to lieutenant commander, but his colleagues gave him a nickname that tells you everything. Granger Richardson, after the sheer number of aircraft that reportedly fell apart under his control. Here's the honest read on this one. Richardson commanded total authority on stage for 6 decades, and in the cockpit he was, by all accounts, a menace to his own aircraft. That's not a knock on his courage. Volunteering to fly at all took plenty of that, but it is worth saying plainly that actor who served doesn't automatically mean actor who excelled. Some of them were simply doing their duty, badly, and living to tell the joke about it afterward. Laurence Olivier was right there next to him, and somehow came out of it with a masterpiece. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier trained as a pilot in the Fleet Air Arm alongside Ralph Richardson, and by most surviving accounts was every bit as accident-prone in the air as his friend was. What Olivier did with the rest of his war mattered more. While still serving, he wrote, directed, and starred in Henry V, a film explicitly built to lift British morale during the war. Shakespeare's speech about "we few, we happy few," delivered to a country that badly needed to hear it. Here's the connection worth drawing between him and Richardson. Two of the finest actors Britain ever produced were, by every measure, unremarkable and even hazardous pilots. But take the same instinct for command, precision, and nerve that they couldn't quite apply to an airplane, and point it at a film about English soldiers facing impossible odds, and you get one of the most effective pieces of wartime propaganda ever made. Their failure in one arena became fuel for a triumph in another. Leo Genn's war didn't give him anything to be witty about afterward. Leo Genn was a practicing barrister before the war. He was commissioned into the Royal Artillery in 1940 and rose to lieutenant colonel. But the part of his service that matters most has nothing to do with combat. In 1945, Genn's legal training was called on. He served with the British unit investigating war crimes at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and was one of the assistant prosecutors at the Belsen trial in Lüneburg, helping build the legal case against the camp staff. This is the moment on the list where we're going to stop and be direct. Nothing else on this countdown carries this kind of weight. A man trained to argue contract disputes was handed the job of documenting the worst crime scene in modern history and helping put its perpetrators on trial. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre, but by his own later writing, the assignment nearly broke him, under-resourced, rushed, trying to build justice out of horror on an impossible deadline. That's not a war story with a clean ending. It's not supposed to be one. Harry Andrews saw a different side of the same war, from inside the guns themselves. Harry Andrews enlisted in 1939 and served with the Royal Artillery through the D-Day landings and the advance into Germany, ending the war as a major and mentioned in dispatches for gallant service. When he finally got leave to see a play back home, he walked straight from the front into the audience of the Old Vic, and within weeks was back on stage himself, because Laurence Olivier remembered him from before the war. Here's why that matters for everything Andrews did afterward. He built an entire career playing sergeant majors and hard-edged officers, and none of it read as performance, because it wasn't drawn from imagination. When critics called his RSM in the Hill psychotic and over the top, they were watching a man who had actually commanded artillery through Normandy translate real command presence into fiction. You can't coach that kind of authority into an actor who hasn't lived a version of it. Patrick McNe came within one illness of never coming home at all. Patrick McNe joined the Royal Navy as an ordinary seaman in 1942, trained as a navigator, and was commissioned. He served on motor torpedo boats patrolling the English Channel and was reassigned as first lieutenant to a second MTB shortly before D-Day. Then he caught bronchitis. While McNe was recovering in hospital, his boat and its crew were lost in action. Sit with that for a second, because it doesn't get more random than this. The only reason Patrick McNe lived to become John Steed in the Avengers is that he got sick at the wrong, or right moment. He said later that the carnage he witnessed in the war was exactly why his most famous character never carried a gun, only an umbrella. Would you call that luck or something else? There isn't really a comfortable answer. Kenneth Moore didn't wait for a script to find the drama. He was narrating his own war live over a loudspeaker. Kenneth Moore received a commission as a sub-lieutenant and served aboard the cruiser HMS Aurora and later the carrier HMS Victorious, seeing action in the Mediterranean, including the invasion of Sicily and the Salerno landings. On Aurora, his crewmates gave him an unofficial job that fit him perfectly. As action broadcaster, Moore used his stage-honed voice to describe combat happening above decks to the men working below, who couldn't see any of it themselves. Here's the connection that's easy to miss: an actor's most useless-sounding peacetime skill. Narrating events clearly and calmly for an audience that can't see them turned out to be a genuinely valuable piece of wartime function, keeping frightened men below decks informed instead of terrified in the dark. Moore earned 3 campaign stars and was on his way to the Pacific when the war ended. He went home to a repertory company in Wolverhampton and, within a decade, was one of the biggest stars in Britain. And that brings us to the one story on this list that reads less like a biography and more like the plot of the exact kind of film he'd later star in. Anthony Quayle. Remember the actor we mentioned at the very start? The one who fought behind enemy lines and never talked about it. This is him. Anthony Quayle was commissioned into the Royal Artillery in 1939, spent time preparing resistance patrols against a potential German invasion of Britain, and then in 1943 joined the Special Operations Executive, the organization Churchill himself set up to run sabotage and resistance operations across occupied Europe. On New Year's Eve 1943, Major Quayle parachuted into Albania to serve as liaison officer with Enver Hoxha's partisan forces fighting the German and Italian occupation. He was there for months, coordinating with local resistance fighters in brutal winter conditions, before malaria and jaundice forced his evacuation. He was mentioned in dispatches for his service. And for decades, by everyone's account, he simply would not discuss what he'd actually done over there. The closest he came was fictionalizing it in a 1945 novel, 8 Hours from England, thinly disguising himself as its hero. Here's the last thing worth saying, and it's the reason he's at number 1, 18 years after Albania. Quayle was cast in the Guns of Navarone as a British Special Forces officer parachuted behind enemy lines to organize sabotage against Axis forces. It's not a loose parallel. It's close enough to his own service that you have to wonder what it cost him to play it. Most actors on this list brought some version of real experience to a war film. Quayle is the only one who had to relive, on camera, something close to the exact operation he'd lived through and never once talked about off it. If you had to guess before we said his name, drop it in the comments and tell us which of these 15 surprised you the most. These men didn't need Hollywood to manufacture their courage. They lived it first, in uniform, and then spent the rest of their careers finding new ways to put it back on screen, sometimes proudly, sometimes reluctantly, and at least twice, without ever explaining it to anyone at all. The next time one of these faces shows up in an old film, remember, some of what you're watching isn't performance, it's memory. If this one hit different, hit like, share it with someone who loves classic British film, and subscribe for the next list, because there are stories on this list's cutting room floor that are just as unbelievable as the 15 you just heard.